What's going on, everyone? I hope you're all having a wonderful day today. In today's video, I want to demonstrate how to create this really cool modern content carousel using Next.js as well as Framer Motion. Before we jump right into it, I want to explain exactly how we're going to do this. So I'm just on Figma now, and this is what the mock-up of the design looks like. So the way the component is going to work is we're going to split the component into two sections. So our first section will be involved with the actual content, and the other side in the other section will be focused on the images as well as these arrows, which will control what image we're looking at. And if we scroll to the right here, I've just laid out some of the steps we're going to be following. So the first step of the video is we're going to be installing some packages. So we're going to be installing things like Next.js, Framer Motion, and Sass or CSS from npm on VS Code. Our second step is actually preparing the assets. So this involves things like importing images, icons, and also creating the carousel component folder. The third step will be involved with the theme build. So we're going to be building out and styling what the theme is going to be. So involves things like styling the H1 tags, the P tags, some of the buttons. This way it just speeds up the work process once we get into the actual component. The fourth step will be involved with the actual carousel component itself, but more so on the styling and static build. So working a lot with SCSS and things like that. And the final step is going to be the functional build. So we're going to be building the functional aspect using use state hooks to control the actual carousel effect, and also Framer Motion to give it those really cool animation effects. So yeah, those are the steps. And without further ado, let's jump right into VS Code. Fantastic. So I've got VS Code opened up. I should also mention, if you want to get access to the original files, I do have a link in the description which takes you to my website. And from there, you can get access to the GitHub repository for the final project. So if you want to use that to follow along, you're more than welcome to do so. Also, the images and assets can also be found there. So highly recommend checking it out. So the first step we want to do is to actually install Next.js. So let's do that right now. What you want to do is come over to the terminal. And I'm just going to get rid of this. There we go. And what you want to type in is npx create next app. And then you want to give it a title. So in this case, I'm just going to call it carousel build. Hit enter. And what should happen now is it should open up with a couple prompts for you to work through. So do you want to use TypeScript? Say yes, this, no, no, yes, yes, no. And from here, it should install the package for us. Fantastic. So it appears it works. If it works like this, the next step you want to do is to go inside of the folder that you just created. So what you want to type in is cd and then put in the folder that you created. So in this case, it's carousel build. And to make sure it's working properly, what you can actually type in is npm run dev. And what should happen now is it should start up a server for you. In this case, it has. And what we can do now is I'm just going to copy this link, go into whatever browser you wish to use. Fantastic. So I've just opened up my browser. This is what the Next.js application is looking like. If yours is looking like this, you've done everything correctly. And we can now move on to the next step. So the next package we want to install is Framer Motion. So in order to do that, just type in npm install Framer Motion, hit enter, and what should happen is we should install our package. Great, it appears it installed successfully. The next one we want to install is Sass. Awesome. So once you've installed all of your packages, the next step is to actually prepare some of the assets that we created. So let's do that right now. So I've just opened up the folder, and what we want to start doing is bring in some of the images and icons that I created. So what we can do now is go into the public folder, and from here we want to create a new folder called images. And from here, I'm just going to quickly go onto the Figma design that I created. I'm going to go into some of the assets that I've created here. Again, these can be found in the GitHub repository, which can be found on my website. So definitely go check it out. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to click on these images and import them over to our images folder here. Great, so I've imported some of the images from the Figma file, as well as some of the icons that I also created. So there we go, that's starting to look good. After doing that, the next step you want to do is to go into your source folder, and from here, we want to create a new folder, and we want to call it carousel, like so. And inside the carousel folder, we want to create two different files. So our first one is going to be our carousel.tsx file. And our second one will be called our carousel.module .scss file, and this is where we'll be doing a lot of the styling. So once you've done that, what you want to do is to go into your carousel.tsx file, type in IAFCE to create a basic template for us. And from here, just type in, this is a carousel, just so we know it's there. After doing that, what you want to do is go into your page.tsx file. And from here, what we want to do is to delete everything within the main div. So I'm going to do that right now. Once you've deleted that, the next thing we want to do is to get rid of this top line here. Save that, and to make sure everything's working perfectly, I'm just going to quickly jump back into the design. As you can see, we have a completely blank canvas, which means it's working. So once you've done that, the next step you want to do is to actually bring in the carousel component that we added just then. So what you want to do is type in import carousel from, and you just link that carousel file there. Once you've done that, the next thing you want to do is to actually grab onto that component, put it into here, like so, close it off, save it, and hopefully if we go back into here, we should have our h1 tag that we just created. The next step and part of this video, once we've installed all of our packages and we've set up all of the different assets, the next step is to actually start creating and building out the theme. So we're going to do that right now. So what we're going to do now is we want to actually comment out the carousel, like so. And what we want to do is we want to add on some basic tags that will be styling as part of the theme. So the first one will be a h1 tag. Just call it, this will be a heading. Let's put in a p tag. This is a p tag. And we also want to put in a button and call it, this is a button. So once you've done that, the next step is to actually go into the page.module.css file. And from here, we want to delete this completely. So there is no styling. Like so. We go back into the page, everything should look like this. If everything's starting to look like this, you're doing everything correctly, which is good. And once you've done that, the next thing you want to do is to actually go into the globals.css file. And from here, we can start manipulating some of the themes and start to work on some of the key elements that we've just added in. So what we want to do is we want to go into our body here. We want to delete this, save that. So that should get rid of those gradients, which it does. This is starting to look really good. So once you've done that and everything's looking the way that you want it to, we can now scroll underneath here and we can start to style out some of the themes. So for example, for the body, if we go into our carousel design, and if I go into our design here, you'll notice that the background is this nice gray. So what I'm going to quickly do is just inspect this and just check out what color is being used here. So if we scroll down here, in this case, it's using hashtag 333. So I'm going to grab that, go into our globals.css file here and put in background color and set it to this. We go back into our file, we should now have a black screen or a dark gray screen rather, and this is starting to look quite good. So once you've done that, we then want to manipulate the h1 tag. So if we go back into our design, I'm just going to quickly close this up so it's easier for you guys to see. I'm going to click on the design that I came up with, and this gives us a whole bunch of properties that we can work with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this, all of these styles here, and go back into our globals.css file here, paste it into here. And since the font family is already into as the default for Next.js, I'm just going to delete that. And another thing we also want to get rid of is the font style. So just get rid of that. So there you go. The h1 tag has been manipulated, which is starting to look quite good. The next item we want to manipulate is the actual p tag. So let's do that right now. We go back into our design here, click on this icon here. I'm just going to quickly copy these properties here. Again, you're more than welcome just to copy and paste these over in your spare time. So I'm just going to paste this into here. Again, we don't need to add our font family and also our font style. And if we go back into here, this is what it's starting to look like, which is quite good. Fantastic. And one of the final items that we want to be manipulating is the actual button. So I'm going to do that right now. So just put in button, and underneath here, we're going to go back into the design. And if we click on the actual button itself, it should give us all of those properties to work with. So if we use this one here for the layout, paste that into there. And also if we use the style here as well and paste it into here, hopefully it looks like how it does in this image here. So let's go back into our icon here. It appears it's working, although it doesn't have a pointer effect. And there's also a non-transparent background. So let's fix that up. So if we go back into our globals.css file, change the background here to transparent. And we also want to ensure the text styles are also followed. In this case, it appears it's not followed properly. So let's fix that up right now. So if we actually target the text itself, it should give us a whole range of properties. In this case, it does. So I'm just going to copy all of these properties here, go into our globals.css file, paste it into here. And we also want to get rid of inter, normal. And hopefully if we jump back, I also might add in a cursor or pointer. The button should hopefully look like how it does in the design. In this case, this looks quite good. Fantastic. Another feature I want to add in is a nice hover effect, just so it's a lot more interesting to look at. So I'm just going to quickly do that now. In order to do this, what you want to do is just put in button, hover. And from here, we can manipulate some of the styling. So for example, the background color, let's give it that nice red color. Let's give it a white text. And we also want to transition it. So we are controlling a smooth motion between the background color, set it to ease, as well as the color itself. Like so. Fantastic. And if we go back into our file here, this is how it looks. That's looking quite good. I'm going to now convert this back over to the button, and hopefully we have a nice smooth transition. There we go. That's starting to look quite good. After doing that, I want it to also be responsive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a media query. So once the screen is less than 750 pixels, we want to manipulate the H1 font size. So it condenses down into something like a mobile screen. So let's do that right now. So let's create a media query, a media screen, and max width. Let's say, I don't know, something like 750 pixels. We want to set the H1 size to something like, I don't know, 3 rem, as opposed to something like 4 rem. Fantastic. So once your design is starting to look like this, and we have created the theme for the actual build, the next step is to go into the actual carousel and start to style out and build out what it's going to look like. So let's do that right now. So what we want to do now is we want to comment out the carousel. So we bring the component back to the main div. And we also want to delete these 3 lines here. So now it should look like this. What we want to do now is to go into the carousel.tsx file. From here, what we want to do is we want to delete the H1 tag since we no longer need that anymore. And underneath this line here, we want to import the styles for the carousel. So let's do that right now. So it should be carousel.module.scss. After doing that, we want to bring in the image functionality with Next.js to the file. So in order to do that, what you want to type in is import image from next/image. This gives us the ability to import and use images into our Next.js application. Once you've done that, the next step we want to do is to import all the files that we have in the public folder here. So again, all of these can be found in the link in the description below. So definitely go check it out. So I'm going to do that right now. There we go. So I now have all of the images that we need. Fantastic. So once you've imported all of the images and also the assets, we can now start to build out the component. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the design. And as you can see, everything is wrapped inside of something called carousel container. So let's create that div right now. In this case, let's call it styles.carousel container, exactly what is shown in the Figma design. Underneath here, we also want to create a new div. And in this case, we want to create this section here, which is called the content container div. So let's add that in right now. So give it a class name called styles.content container. Next to it, we have this one here, which is going to be called the images container div. So let's create that right now. I'm just going to copy this down and just call it images container, like so. So once you've done that, the next thing you want to do is to start unpacking the content container. So what we're going to do is create an indent like so. And if we go back into the design, we have a H1 tag. And what we want to do is put that inside of a div called title container. So let's do that right now. I'm going to create a div and give it a class name called styles.title container. And inside of the title container, we want to give it a H1. In this case, I'm just going to call it, and in this instance, I'm just going to call it, this is a title, like so. So once you've done that, and if we go back into the design, hopefully we get that. Yep, in this case, we've got it right here, which means it's working. After doing that, and if we go back into our actual design here, you will notice we have a p tag. And in this instance, I'm going to also do a similar approach and wrap it inside of another container. In this case, I'm going to call it something like styles.description container. And inside of here, I'm going to give it a p tag and just call it, this is a p tag, like so, just so we know it's there. And if we go back into here, and as you can see, we have the p tag, which is starting to appear. So that's starting to look quite good. After adding that, we also want to add in a button as well. So let's add that in here. So if we go onto the button, it also has a container. So let's add that in right now. And it's called button container. Fantastic. So let's add that in right now. Styles.button container. And if I scroll down and add in a new indent and give it a button, and on the design, I'm just going to call it exactly how it is here. Since the final product, this value here never changes. It stays the same. So we can keep it as learn more, like so. Fantastic. And if we go back into our design, this is what it's starting to look like. So we have our H1, our P tag, also our button. Fantastic. After doing that, we now want to start importing some of our images over, as well as the icons here, which represent the different arrows that we have also imported over. So inside the carousel.tsx file here, what we want to do now is go out of the content.container div, and we want to open up the images container div, which is this one here. So what we're going to do is we want to first create three different things, since we're working with three different images. The first one is going to be called first container. The second one is going to be called second container. And the third div is going to be called third container. So let's add those in right now. So let's go div and give it a class name of styles.firstContainer. Inside of the first container, we want to add in a image element. And since we've imported these images in here, as well as the image property from next/image, this will allow us to actually add in an image like so. I'm going to give it an alt text and just call it first image for the sake of this video. Obviously, you can change this. And we also want to link it to image one like so. So if we save that, and if we go back into the design, we now have an image starting to appear, which means it's starting to work. Fantastic. And what we want to do now is we want to take this first container here, and we want to copy it a couple more times underneath. So instead of calling it first container, let's call it second container, and change the title here to second container, and change number one here to 2, and do the exact same thing underneath. So instead of second, we want to give it a third container, and again, third image, and also image 3. It's quite repetitive, but once you've added all of these in, and if we check the design, hopefully they're all starting to appear. In this case, all of our images are appearing, which is really, really good. At this stage, it's not styled to how we want at this stage, but as long as we've got the assets there and the actual skeleton, this is all that we should be focusing on at this stage of the video. So if we hop back into the design, we have our content, our images. However, we are missing our controls here. So what we're going to do now is to bring those in. So if we go back into our carousel here, and if we go underneath our third container, we want to create a new div. And if we go onto the actual container, it should be called controls. In this case, it is. So let's call it controls. Fantastic. After doing that, what we want to do from here is we want to create a new button, and we want to give it a class name called previous container. And we also want to create a second button called next container, like so. So once you've created the two buttons, the next step is we want to import the images that we created on Figma. Again, these can be found on the GitHub repository in the link below, so definitely go check it out. So underneath this div here, we want to import an image, alt, just call it previous button, and we want to give it a source of, in this case, since we want to make it exactly how it looks here, let's just bring in the previous disabled design. So I'm just going to link this one in here. Obviously, this is going to be manipulated, but for the time being, just keep it as it is since we're just doing the static build. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this image, paste it in here, and call it next enabled. So now if we go back into the design, should hopefully see those icons appearing. In this case, they are appearing like so. The global styles have override them, but don't worry, we're going to be manipulating this later on in the video, so stay tuned. Fantastic. So once your design is looking like this, we can now start to actually style out the component. So let's do that right now. So I'm back on the VS Code file here, and I've just broken it up into two sections just so it's easier for me to read. So if we go into the carousel design here, what we want to do is to try and create this effect in the desktop view. So in order to create this, what we want to do for the actual carousel container is we want to create a grid effect. So we have two columns, so one to the left, one to the right. So if we go back into our carousel.tsx file here, and if we target the carousel container div here, I'm going to grab that class name. What we want to do is give it a display of grid. That way we can manipulate how many columns or rows we want to use. Before we do that, let's give it a height of something like, I don't know, 100 vertical height, so it spans the entire viewport. We also want to give it a width of something like, I don't know, 100 vertical width, so it spans from left to right, 100 vertical width. And in order to create those two columns, what we're going to do is type in grid template columns, set those two to 50%, 50%. And we also want to create a grid template row and set that to 100%, so it spans the entire viewport from left to right. After doing that, what you want to do is to align items to center. And after doing that, we want to make sure that the content is spaced between. So we'll just add that in like so. And we also want to give it some left and right padding. So I'm going to make sure the top and bottom is set to 0. And for the left and right, when it's on desktop view, set to 10 vertical width. So now if we go into the design, hopefully things are spanning from left to right. In this case, it is. So our content is on the left and our images to the right. And that's starting to look quite good. After doing that, and if we quickly go to our content container here, you'll notice there is a padding between the P tag, the H1 tag, as well as the button here. So we're going to add that in right now. Let's go into our carousel.tsx file. Let's target the content container like I showed you guys in the actual Figma design. Inside of the content container, we don't want to change anything there, but we do want to manipulate the title container, which controls the H1 tag. And let's give it some padding of something like 0, 0, and 2 rem for the bottom. Let's copy this exact same thing, paste it underneath here, and change this to description container. So hopefully, if we look at the design, our build is starting to look like this. So if we hop back into the build, there we go. We have our heading here. We have our P tag as well as our button. So the next step and part of the video, as part of the static and styling build for the carousel effect, is to work on the images container. So what I'm going to do now is underneath the content container, I'm going to target the images container like so. And inside of here, and if we quickly go back into the design, you'll notice the images span from right to left. So let's use a display of flex to create that effect. And since the positioning of them are reversed, we want to change that flex direction to row reverse. So now if we go back into the design, the images should be spanning from right to left. So if we go back into the file, the next thing we want to do after doing that is to align items to center. And we also want to justify content to flex start. Another thing we want to add in is to set the position to relative. So if we decide to change these images to absolute, which we will in a second, images will remain intact within that parent div. So super important that you guys do that. After doing that and setting the position to relative, another thing we want to do is set a fixed height to something like 35 rem. The first image I want to work on is the first image here, and I want to make sure that it's set directly to the far right of this container here. So in order to do that, what we can do now is if we go into the first container, we want to target this underneath here. Let's target that. Let's set the Z index of this value to 2. We want to set the width to something like a clamp value. That way it can be changed depending on the screen size. So let's set 2 values of 20 rem as the lowest, 25 as the largest, with a preferred value of 22.5 vertical width. And let's set the height to auto. And we also want to set the position to absolute. After doing that, and there's a step that I forgot to mention, please make sure to also give these images here a class name. So let's do that right now. For our first image here, we're going to give it a class name of first and apply this same class to the next one, but instead of first, call it second, and do it to the third one as well. So let's add that in there and call it third. Fantastic. This way it gives us the ability to actually start manipulating the image themselves. So what we can do now, since we've created that class name, go underneath the first container as the parent div. We want to create this nice effect here. So I've gone ahead, clicked on the image, and it's giving me these properties. So I'm just going to copy these two, paste it into here. And we also want to grab the width itself, paste that into there. And we also want to add in our height of auto like so. Once you've done that and everything looks similar to how it does in the code like I have here, if we go into the design, it should start to look like this nice border effect, and that's starting to look quite good. So once you've done that, we want to apply these exact properties onto the next 2 images. So I'm just going to copy this like so, go into this, change this to second, again, change this to second. Instead of having a Z index of 2, we want the second image to be underneath the first one. So if we go into the design, as you can see, it's underneath the first image here. So please make sure to change the Z index for the second image to 1. And if we apply the same principle, copy and paste it, change it to third. So now we're controlling the third image in this instance. Please make sure that, again, the Z index of this is set to 0. So it goes from 2, 1, 0, and it creates this overlay effect. Fantastic. You will notice now, if we go back into the actual design, you should only see the first image, which means it's working. So basically what happens now is later on in the video, we're going to be using Framer Motion to adjust the actual positioning of the images. This part of the video is just to get the structure up and make sure that it's working appropriately. And just to make sure all the images are there, what I'm going to quickly do is I'm going to go into our first image here. I'm going to hit display none, and we should see the second image underneath. And just to make sure that's working, there we go. The second image is appearing. If yours is starting to look like this, it means you've done everything correctly, and we can move on to the next step. So the next step of the video is we're going to be manipulating some of the controls here. So let's start working on that now. Underneath third container, and if we go back into our carousel.tsx file here, I'm going to target the controls div here. And inside of controls, what we want to do is we want to display flex, so things span from left to right. Make sure that the justify content is spaced between. Set the position to absolute so we can move it around freely. We want to set a left value of 0 so it spans furthest to the left of the image container div. After doing that, we want to give it a width of something like 10 rem. Let's give it a Z index of 3 so it's above all of the images that we just created. And let's transform and push it down a bit. So let's push it down by, I don't know, 5 rem. So if we save this and if we go back into the file, we should start to see our icons here appearing. So if I inspect the page, bring this out like so, And if we have a look here, what I might also do is instead of placing it in the left, I also might go back into here and change the bottom value as well to 0. And hopefully that should lower it so it mimics the design here. So change that to bottom 0. The arrow should be underneath here. So hopefully that's how it's starting to look. Yep, that's what it's looking like now. That's starting to look quite good. Again, these styles aren't quite the way that I want them to look like. This is because it's using the globals.css file. So let's override them right now. So after doing that, the next thing we want to do is to target the previous container div, as well as the next container class name div. After doing that, we want to display those items to flex. We want to make sure that the align items are set to center. We also want to justify content to center. We want to set, in this instance, the background color to transparent, so there's no background color appearing. The thing we want to add in is a border and give it something like 2 pixels solid. And in this instance, when it's not being used, we want to change it to transparent. After doing that, we want to give it a nice transition effect. So let's control the border color for 0.3 seconds ease, as well as the transform effect with 0.3 seconds set to ease. So after doing that, the next thing we want to do is set some height properties. So let's give it something like 4.5 rem and set the width to, I don't know, the exact same as well. And I'll just quickly fix this up. Great. So once you've done that, if we go back into the file, you'll now notice that we no longer have those effects being applied. We now want to go back in and give it some hover effects so it mimics the final design that we came up with. So what we can do now is, after doing that, go underneath here, basically grab the exact same thing, delete all of this and change these to :hover. So we control the hover state of these two classes. So with these, let's, I don't know, control something like the border color, I guess, and change it to this value here, 2 pixels solid. So if we go back, hopefully that's starting to appear. Not this instance, that's all right. That's why I've just changed it to border, not border color. So hopefully if we hover over, yep, that's how it's starting to look. That's looking quite good. One thing I noticed with the design is it's got quite a long width. So let's change this down to 10 rem. Hopefully, yep, that looks a lot cleaner. Fantastic. So after doing that, we also want to create a class for a disabled arrow. So when the user can no longer continue to activate the carousel, we want to give it a disabled class name. So inside of the disabled class name, what we're going to do is we're going to copy these over like so. And we just want to make sure that the border is set to transparent like so, and no hover effect. So if we go into our carousel here, and in fact, what I might quickly do is to just open this up. And let's say, for instance, instead of being called previous container, we're going to call it disabled. You'll notice now if I put my cursor over it, there's no border appearing. However, there is a cursor pointer. So in order to fix that, I'm going to quickly open this up, change this to cursor and change it to initial. So when we hover over the disabled class name, the icon looks like this. But then when we hover over here, the cursor changes to a pointer, indicating to the user that it can actually be used and activated. So that's starting to look quite good. You'll notice if we inspect the page and actually change the sizing of it, it's not responsive. So we're going to quickly work on that right now. So what we can do now is create some media queries. So if I go under here, type in media screen and set the max width of something like, I don't know, 1199 pixels. So from here, let's change the padding, the side padding. Instead of setting it to 10 vertical width, let's give it something like, I don't know, 5 vertical width. So now if we go into here and if we inspect the page, you'll notice as we zoom in past 1199 pixels, it changes the padding value. As you can see, that's looking quite good. Although it'll get to a point where you can no longer see the text. So let's fix that right now. We want to create a second media query. And And in this instance, we want to control it so that once the user goes past 950 pixels, we want the following to apply. So let's target the carousel container and let's change the grid direction. So instead of having 2 columns, we just want to have 1 column and 2 rows. So in order to do that, we want to again keep it as grid template columns to let's do 100%. And also the rows, let's give it, I don't know, 1 fraction. Let's set the heights to 100 vertical height. And again, the same thing applies to the width, but instead of impacting the width, we want to do vertical width like so. Fantastic. So after doing that, we then want to control the content container. Start to manipulate this by adding some padding to the top. So let's give it some 5 rem, 0 for the right, 5 rem for the bottom, 0 for the left. And another one we want to start working on is the images container. So I'm just going to quickly grab this. And with this images container, we want to also apply that same padding so that it is quite consistent throughout the design. After doing that, we want to go underneath here. And we also want to control the actual controls that we were working on earlier on. And with this, we just want to give it some bottom padding, just so there's some spacing at the bottom of the page. Fantastic. So if we go back into here, if we scroll past that value that I just created, this is what it's starting to look like. And that's looking really, really cool. Fantastic. So once your design is looking like that, you've done all of the SCSS styling, and you've also structured the static of what the design is going to look like. The next step of the video is we're going to start working with use state hooks to create some of those functional capabilities, as well as using Framer Motion to create the really cool animation effects. So without further ado, let's dive right into it. So the first thing we want to do, since we're going to be using useState as well as Framer Motion, these are brought in from external parties and Next.js doesn't like that. So you need to convert this component to a client component. So in order to do that, what you want to do is type in at the very top in quotations, use client. After doing that, we can now bring in Framer Motion as well as our useState hooks. So let's do that right now. What we want to do now is just type in useState, and it should bring in the useState property from React as shown here. Secondly, we want to import our Framer Motion package. So in order to do that, just type in import motion from Framer Motion. Once you've done that and you have your useState and motion, we can now move on to the next step. So the next step of the video is we want to start working on manipulating the actual content container to start off with. We'll focus on the images later on. So in order to do this, we're going to be primarily focusing on the useState hooks. So let's do that right now. Just to make things easier, I'm going to leave some comments for you guys so it's easier for you guys to understand. So the first useState hook that we want to control is the image index state. So this controls and lets the browser know what state the images and also the content is on. So in order to create this, we want to create a const with square brackets. And we want to first call the const active index. And whenever we want to manipulate it in a function, we want to call it set in active index. And we want to equal that to useState and give it a value of 0. What this basically tells us is the default active index value is set to 0. But once we want to manipulate it using the set active index state here, we can actually start to change this value here, which will ultimately change what the content looks like and also the images. Once you've defined what the image index state is, the next we want to look into is the transition direction state. So the transition direction state tells and determines the class names what state it's going to be. So let's go into transition direction. And we want to set the transition direction with a string value of next. So basically we can create a Boolean value where if the value is not set to next, we want it to go to previous and so forth. So super important to have these two values just so that the actual carousel can work the way that we want it to. The next step is we want to create a function to handle the actual button clicks. So this is when we start to click on these buttons here. So once we click on, let's say, the next container, we want it so that the value here of the set active index to change to 1, and also to determine and tell the browser that this value here is being applied, being next. So let's add a function in to control those variables. So call it function to handle next button click. So this function here is going to determine and control the next button, which is this one here. So let's work on that right now. Let's create a const and call it handle next. And we want to give it a arrow function like so. And since we want to manipulate, let me just quickly fix this. Since we want to manipulate the transitional direction state, what we can do is bring that in like so. And we want to set that value to next. And we also want to adjust this value here. So what we're going to do is we're going to target the set active index value here. This way we can actually manipulate the active index value. So based on whatever the previous index value was, we want to give it some properties whereby if the previous index is valued or at a value of 2, then we want the previous index to be set to its value. Otherwise, we want the previous index to be added to 1. So what this is basically saying is if the previous index is set to 2, we want that value to stay at 2 at all times. However, if it's a value like, I don't know, 1 or something, then upon clicking on the item, we want that number 1 to be added to 1, which makes it 2. So this way it controls the items going from 0 to 2. And once it gets to 2, it stops at that. So once you've created your handle next function, the next function we want to focus on is the previous button click. So what we can do now is change this value to previous. And instead of setting this to next, we want to set it to previous. And for the previous set active index here, it's the exact same thing. The only thing is once the value is set to 0, we want the previous index to remain on 0 at all times. However, if it gets to a value greater than 0, we want the value to be -1. So for example, if the use state here was set to something like 2, since the value doesn't equal 0, it's going to be 2 minus 1, which becomes 1. That becomes the new active index. After doing that, what we're going to do is to actually create an array of text that we can use, and we'll start to manipulate the h1 tag so it actually uses those values. So let's do that right now. So let's call it array for titles and descriptions. So what I've done is I've gone ahead prior to the video and actually created that array. So I'm just going to copy and paste it into here. Again, these files can be found on the GitHub repository if you want to follow along. So make sure to go ahead and save you time by doing so. So basically these text arrays determine what these titles and descriptions will appear depending on what value the active index will be set to. In this instance, if it's set to 0, when the user opens it up, this first array item here will appear. So what we need to do now is to target these values here and apply them inside of the h1 and also the p tags. So let's do that right now. So what we can do now is we can actually get rid of this h1 tag here. And what we can do now is with curly brackets, we want to target the array name. In this case, it's called texts. And if we go into here and with those array texts, we want to then target the active index value. So that determines what value is shown here. In this instance, it's 0. So it's going to be targeting this section here. And from here, inside of this part here, I want to target the title. So in order to actually target that, what you want to do is just type in .title. So to make sure this is working, I've saved the file and I'm going to go into here. We now have our new h1 value here, which is based off that array that we created earlier on. And to make sure that this is working perfectly, I'm just going to type in hello world just to make sure this is working perfectly. As you can see, it's completely manipulative and you can work around with this and change it to whatever text you like. In this instance, I'm just going to keep it to this. So once you've done that, another item that we need to look into is the actual description. So what we can do now is just delete that inside of the P tag and replace it with this line of code. But instead of title, we want to target the description. So let's replace this title value here with description. Let's save that. And if we go into here, there we go. We have our description and that's starting to look really, really cool. To make sure that this is working, what we can actually do is we can actually console log out the active index value here. And if we go into our console log here, and let me just quickly open this up, you'll notice that the value of our active index, and I'll just quickly zoom in so it's easier for you guys to read, is set to 0. However, if we were to go up here and change this value to something like 1, for example, you'll notice the title changes completely and that value of the active index changes to 1, which is exactly what we want to be happening. However, in order to manipulate the values from 0 to 2, this is where these lines of code come in handy that we created earlier on. So what we're going to do now is we are going to apply these functions inside of the buttons. And that way, each time we click on an item, the values of the array will change and it will go through these values from 0 to 2. So let's do that right now. I'm going to quickly change the use state here back to 0. And I'm also going to delete the console log since we no longer need it. So in order for this to work, it's really simple. Just scroll down to the bottom of the page and you'll notice we have our 2 buttons that we created earlier on. And in order to create that function, all you have to type in is onClick equals and target handle previous click. So let's add that in here since this is controlling the previous item here. And also applying the same principle, but instead of handle previous, we want to go handle next. So now whenever we click on those 2 items there, if we refresh the page, it should now start to manipulate our items here. And that's starting to look really cool. You may notice that the styles aren't changing each time I click through the items. So what we're going to do now is, depending on the active index state, whatever value that's on, we're going to determine what type of style we want to apply to these images here based on the controls. So what we're going to do now is manipulate the class name. So in order to do this, what we can do now is we can determine if the active index is set to 0, then we want the class name to be set to the following. So we're just going to add this in here. We're going to call it disabled. Otherwise, we want the class name to be set to styles.previous container, like so. And if we, just to make sure this is working, if we go into here and if we inspect the page, actually what I might quickly do is go back and console log out the active index value, like so. This way it should determine what the value of our active index here. So the value is set to 0. If we click on here, it's set to 1. However, if we hover over the actual container, it shows that it's actually working. So in order to manipulate and change the actual image icon over to the enabled version, what you want to do is apply that same principle that we did here, but to the actual image. So what we can do now is give it a function. So if the active index is set to 0, then we want the previous disabled button to be used. Otherwise, we want the previous enabled button to be used, which has been imported up here, like so. So what we can do now is if we go back into our browser, as you can see, when I change it to the next icon, the arrow here changes to the enabled version and we have this nice hover effect. And when it's back to the value of 0, it's gone to a disabled class name. And yeah, that's how it's starting to look. And that's looking really, really good. What we're going to do now is apply this same principle, but to the next button here. So that way, once the active index is set to number 2, we can change this to a disabled version. So let's do that right now. Let's go back into here. And we want to literally apply this same principle. I'm just going to copy this class name here just to save time. Go into here. So if active index is the same as 2, and we want to change this to next container, save that. And again, same with the source itself. But this time, instead of being set to 0, We want to set to 2, and we want to change this to next instead of previous. So hopefully, once I have applied these changes, and if we go back into our file here, you can now see it is completely responsive, and depending on what the active index value is, it determines how the icons will look. And that's starting to look really, really cool. Next part of the video, we're going to be working with Framer Motion, and that's going to determine and create those really cool animation effects. The first part of Framer Motion, we're going to be manipulating the content container here. So creating really nice, smooth transitions with the text. And then finally, at the very end, we're going to be manipulating how the images will look when we click on these arrows here, which I'm super excited to show you. So let's jump right into it right now. So what we want to do is underneath our array that we created, we want to create a new comment and call it defining text animation. So since we're working with the content container, which is this part here, we want to start manipulating that with some really cool animations. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is to create a new const and call it text variance. This will determine how the before and after effects will look. So in order to create those, we first want to create a before effect, which is our hidden value here. Inside of here, we're going to create 3 different properties. So our first one is our opacity. The starting point, we want to make sure it's set to 0. With the X value, so if the transitional direction, which I created up here earlier on, so if this value is the same as next, then we want the value to be set to 100. Otherwise, we want the starting point to be set to -100. And we also want to give it a transition as part of the third property with a duration of something like 0.5 seconds. Set the ease to something like ease in, out. So once you've determined what the before or hidden effect is going to look like, we then want to show what the after effect is going to look like, or rather the visible property. So in order to do this, just type in visible. And inside of here, I'm just going to copy these values over like so. Set the opacity here to 1. We don't need any of this, so just set it to 0 so it goes back to its original location. And we also want to give it a duration of 0.5 seconds, ease set to ease in, out, like so. So after doing that, what we can do now is I want to give it a nice stagger effect inside of the content container. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a statement up here as a comment defining the stagger text effect. And in order to create a staggered effect, what we want to do is create a new const and call it text container variance. Equal that to some curly brackets. And we want to give it some hidden value of blank and a visible value so that the transition, we want to stagger the children by 0.1 seconds. And this will be impacting both the H1 and P tag. So after creating your variants for the text, as shown here, our before and after effect, as well as our stagger effect, what we want to do now is come over to the parent div. In this instance, we're working with the content container. So what we want to do here is we want to first create a key depending on what's being manipulated. In this case, it's the active index. So after doing that, we want to set a new variant called variance. And inside of variance, we want this to be targeting the text container variant. This will allow us to have that staggering effect. On top of that, we also want to set an initial state, and we want to target this as being hidden, as well as an animate state and targeting it as being visible like so. As you can see, we have some issues here. So in order to fix this and convert it to a Framer Motion component, what you want to do is transform this div into something called a motion.div like so, and apply it to the very end. This way it wraps the Framer Motion properties inside of that div. So we can start to use some of these properties that we just added into our parent container here, which is fantastic. After doing that, what we want to do now is, since our variance is controlled inside of here, being the parent div, we now want to directly target our H1 and P tag, which will involve these values here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to copy this const that I created here called text variance. And prior to doing that, I am going to add in a motion.h1 value like so, and apply it as well to the p tag. So after doing that, what we're going to do now is we want to add a space, add something called a variance value here, and we want to target the text variance value. And what we can do now is copy this over to our p tag, save that. To make sure this is working, once we've applied these properties to the parent div as well as our h1 and p tag, I'm going to go inside of our file here. And just to make sure this is working, I'm going to quickly refresh the page. We have this nice animation transition occurring. That's starting to look really, really cool. So once we've completed the content container part of the video, the next step is to start manipulating how the images look, depending on where the actual positioning of the active index will be. So let's get into that right now. So in order for this to work, similar to like what we did before, we want to convert these divs to motion divs. So let's do that right now. And apply this principle not just to the first container, but also to the second and third container. So once your divs have been converted to motion divs, we can now start to manipulate some of the properties. So what we can do now is inside of our first container here, what we're going to do is to create a new property called animate. And inside of here, you want to create two curly brackets like so, and we want to create three properties. So our first property, we want to control the opacity. In the design, you can see it's set to 100%. So let's create a function depending on what the active index is. We can determine what type of opacity we want to use. So if the active index value, since the default is 0, is the same as 0, then I want the opacity set to 1. Otherwise, if the active index is set to 1, then I want the value to be 0. Otherwise, if it's set to 2, then I also want the value to be set to 0. So that's the first property, controlling the opacity. The second one we want to control is the positioning of the X value. So similar to before, if the active index value is set to 0, then I want our X value to be set to 0 pixels. However, if the active index is set to something like 1, then I want the value of the pixels to be set to 96 pixels. So it's moving 96 pixels to the right. Otherwise, for the default value, when it's set to 2, I want the value to be kept at 96 pixels like so. So once we've set those two, the next one we want to add in is scale. So if the active index is set to 0, then I want the value of this to be set to 1. However, if the active index is set to something like 1, then I want it to be scaled up slightly. So let's give it something like 1.2. And if it's set to 2, then let's set it to 1.2 like so. Fantastic. So what we've done, we've gone ahead and created 3 different variables depending on what the active index value is set to. And in order to determine how this transition actually looks and how smooth it is, we want to create a new property and call it transition. This property in Framer Motion allows us to determine how fast we want the animation to occur and also the delay and ease. So what we can do now is for the duration, let's set it to something like 0.5 seconds. For the delay, let's set it to 0 since we don't want a delay with the changing of the images. And for the ease, let's change it to ease in out so it's nice and smooth. So in order to make sure that this is working properly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my design. I'm going to quickly refresh the page. And if I change the image, we should have this nice transitional effect, which looks really, really cool. And if I go back to the image, it goes back to exactly how it was, depending on what the value of the active index is. That's starting to look fantastic. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to copy and paste these properties over and paste it into our second container like so. And what we can do now is we can start to manipulate some of these values depending on where it is once the active value is set to 0, 1, or 2. So with the second container, if we go into the design, it's moved slightly to the left. It's got an opacity of something like 2/3 of what exists here. And it's got a slightly smaller scale to it. So let's work on that now. So what we can do now for the opacity, once it's set to 0, I want this value to be set back to 0.66. So it's 1/3. Sorry, so it's 2/3 of 100%. For the active index, once it's set to 1, I want that value to be set to 1, so it's 100%. And once it goes to active index value of number 2, I want that value to be set to 0, so it's non-existent. Again, the same thing applies here. What I might do is grab this and set this to negative 96 pixels, change this to 0 pixels, and once the value goes beyond 1, in this case number 2, it goes to 96 pixels. Fantastic. For the scale, what we can do here, since it's going up increments of 0.2, once it's on 0, I want the value to be set to 0.8, 1, and 1.2. So I've opened up my design, and this is how it's looking like. Our second image falls behind our first image with a lower opacity and also scale and X position. If we change the state, again, it goes to whatever the active state of 1 and what the properties should be. And if I click on this again, it should disappear like so. And that's starting to look really, really cool. So what we can do now is go back into our file here. And what we can do now is apply and copy and paste these properties and apply the exact same thing to the third container like so. And all we have to do now is just slightly tweak these depending on what the active index is. So in this case, if it's set to 1, set to 0.661. For the active index, let's set this to something like 192 pixels, minus 96 pixels, and 0 pixels, like so. And for the scale, let's go 0.6, 0.8. So it's incrementally increasing depending on what the active index value is. And once we've done that, we should now have a final design. So let's see how this is looking. Wow, this is looking awesome. And if I refresh the page, we have this nice transitional effect, which is looking awesome. Have a look at that. That is looking fantastic. Another great thing about the design is earlier on in the video, we made sure that it's responsive. So we changed the positioning of it. As you can see, that looks quite good. Even in a mobile view, this is how it's looking. That's looking really cool. Find that the positioning of this is quite close to the images here. So what I actually might do is go back into our carousel here and for the controls themselves. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this value here, go back into our controls here, and I'm going to translate it by something like 8 rem. So that should hopefully pull it down a bit. And it does. And that's looking fantastic. If you guys did enjoy this video, please let me know in the comments below. I really would love to know if you learned something really cool or if there's anything in particular you'd like to expand on. More than happy to create content around that. And yeah, that's the end of the video. If you'd like to see similar videos like this, I do have a playlist dedicated to front-end development related motion, component, and project builds. So definitely go check it out. And yeah, that's basically the end of it. So without further ado, hope you guys learned something and I'll catch you in the next one. See you later.